certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
If it weren't for a bizarre set of circumstances, Jane Rimmer may have never been found. Today in court, a witness tearfully recounted the day when picking flowers led her to a woman's body. I'm Natalie Bonjolo. Welcome to Claremont in Conversation with Tim Clark and Alison Fan, who are both calling in from Supreme Court, which has wrapped up very late in the day today.
Yes, it did, Nat, yeah. And that was because they were basically tying up all the loose ends before the Christmas and New Year break. So they didn't want to come back tomorrow just for sort of 20 minutes, half an hour worth. So they basically sat a little bit later tonight to get it all done. And then, so yes, we're done for this year. And we were given a good indication of what's to come early next year, which we'll discuss later.
Yeah, all right. Well, we'll talk about that later and give everyone a heads up of what to expect in the new year. All right. Well, let's dive into today's evidence. Can you talk us through the unusual events which led to the discovery in Wellard of Jane's body?
There's been some fairly bizarre series of events, almost supernatural, the way the animals are playing a big part. We had the horse that reared up, and today we had a rooster or a chicken, or a chook, as the witness described it, run across the car that made them slam on the brakes and stop. And the kids got out to chase the chicken, and the mother said, well, I'll just go and pick a couple of lilies over there. And then, lo and behold, she stumbles on Jane's body, a very, very gruesome discovery for this mother of 3 children. She had friends with her as well. And as we were saying earlier, first we had a horse that reared up, and now we have a rooster that stops right there where the body is found.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking, really, the testimony today. The lady was obviously still
very distressed,
hugely upset about it. And as soon as it got to that point of the discovery, basically, as Ali said, this chook had run off, the kids had run off, and she was in the car and just spotted these arum lilies, or also called death lilies, and basically went into the verge to pick a couple, and then she said something glittered, or something just caught it, something out of the corner of her eye, and she said she'd seen the biggest lily that she'd ever seen, so that she made her way over there, leaned in to pick it, as we've mentioned before, only a couple of metres off the road, and felt something brush the back of her leg. She thought it was a stick or a bit of foliage, looked round, and it was a foot, and a human foot. And then she said, obviously, I wasn't really registering what I was seeing, but I followed the foot up the body and realised what the horrifying thing that was in front of me, and basically stepped back onto the road, started calling for her husband. He came in, basically didn't believe her at the time, said, well, no, it must be an animal, must be a sheep or something. He went in, took a quick look, came back out, went in again, and basically found that what his wife had seen, that he was seeing as well. And then, as Ali mentioned again, as they came back out on the road, this is when this couple on horseback that we've heard about before, they were there. This lady, Tammy, basically said, no, I want to stay here. She basically got her dog out of the car. Her husband went off to get help. And then the police arrived in due course. It was heartbreaking, really.
Was Tammy, it must have been very distressing. Was she upset giving this testimony today?
She was. She was very upset. Yeah, she was crying. She had to stop a few times and very distressed. But she told how she stayed there while her husband went to the nearby riding school, came back with a few others, but she stayed there with the body, didn't she?
Yeah, and she, as you mentioned, she was obviously distressed then and still distressed more than 20 years on today. Had to compose herself several times during the testimony, but she did get through it, and she gave a very clear recollection of what she'd found, as you might expect, because that is not a moment that you'd ever forget once you'd experienced it. And she just basically described after the discovery, staying there, waiting for the police to come, getting in the car. And she had a sort of very clear recollection of the exact spot. She was asked to sort of spot it on a map, and she did that, almost immediately and almost exactly to where the other descriptions have been.
Were they asked if they touched anything?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, they were, and that's obviously a very important piece because of the forensic evidence to come on the body, and they were all very clear. Both witnesses, both Mr. and Mrs. Evans, were very clear that the only tiny touch was that brush on the calf that actually alerted Mrs. Evans to the body there. But other than that, they said they kept their distance quite deliberately by the sound of it. I mean, who would want to get too close, obviously? But that they were also very clear on what they did do and certainly what they didn't do.
And just sitting there listening to this in court today, I mean, it almost sounds completely unbelievable, this chain of events that have led to the discovery of Jane's body, almost some sort of, strange fate.
Well, I remember the day clearly when we were told about it because we all rushed out there. We were all at another conference, and when we heard about it, we raced out there, and I remember it clearly because I took the undercarriage of my car, half wrecked it because it was over limestone. It was a very rural area, fairly, the area around it and the roadway, etc. And I remember damaging the bottom of my car. So I remember, that was when Jane's body was found at Wellard. Yeah. It was quite that was when everybody knew there was a Claremont serial killer. Not just a one-off that Sarah had maybe disappeared. That was when they really got serious.
And I'm curious, Ali, back then, did you have any of these kind of details about how... No, we had nothing. Police kept it all very, very quiet, and in fact what we're hearing now are investigations going on, like the fact that they checked the airports for Sarah having maybe gone overseas. We didn't hear any of that. They kept everything very quiet. And I guess it wasn't until Jane went that they really started looking seriously at a serial killer. Yeah. So it was obviously quite a difficult day in court because you also heard from the man who stumbled across the body of the third victim, Ciara Glennon.
Yeah, that was also quite harrowing listening, Nat. This was a chap, again, it was just pure chance that he was even out there on that morning. He basically said that his girlfriend was at work, he'd borrowed her car, and he was basically going out, in his words, to look for something that he shouldn't have been looking for, which...
What was that?
Where pressed gently, he said he was out there looking for some wild-grown cannabis plants. He said he'd found bits and bobs, but nothing to write home about until, obviously, a little way off this beaten track, Piccadilly Road, which once again, at the time, back in 97, was very rural. And he just wandered off. He said first he could smell something really bad. And then he said, look, I'm a nosy type of bloke, so I went to have a look. And that's when he found the remains. Under cross-examination, he actually said that he thought it might have been a kangaroo when he was out bushwalking and doing these other activities, that if he did find the body of a kangaroo, he would always check the pouch for joeys, for the little babies, which are sometimes left in there, so which is why he went over. But he said he got within 2 meters and realised that this was something a lot worse. Pulled some bush back to basically check what he thought he was seeing was what he was seeing, and he did that. And then he basically said, once he confirmed it in his own head, he dropped and ran. He basically got back in his car, whipped over to where his girlfriend worked about 5 minutes away, and called the police. And then some uniformed officers turned up, and then detectives turned up, and he took them back to the scene. And that was basically the crux of his evidence. But
what was the terrain like there? Was he asked to describe it? Or?
Yeah, it's sort of low. I mean, typical West Australia, the Australiana, sort of low scrub bush, not dense forest, but, you know, what used to be called black boys, but they're a sort of a grass tree that are quite thick, but you know, they wouldn't cover the ground area there, and some effort, as we've previously heard, some effort had been made to try and cover the body, but obviously not well enough that it wasn't noticeable.
Ali, Ali, do you recall the day when Ciara Glennon was found?
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Because I'd become quite close to the Glennon family. And, yeah, it was horrible. Well, it was just puzzling because it was from one extreme to the other. You had Jane Rimmer right down south, and then you had Ciara north. And, of course, Ciara has never been found, so we don't know where she is.
Yeah, and looking back in the archives of the newspaper archives, as I've done sort of on various days throughout the trial, Matt, the headline on the morning after Ciara's body was discovered was "The state is in mourning," and I mean that really brings it
that just
home
gave me shivers.
How big a discovery this was. And I mean, to be fair, there was a little bit of sniggering in court when Mr. Atkinson, who's the chap that discovered Ciara's body, started giving his evidence. But I mean, if you consider it, but for him,
yes,
she might never have been found. And it's another one of those sliding door moments that we just keep repeating. Just a chance thing that he just happened to go into, 10 metres down the road or 10 metres further back, he might not have seen what he saw. And the most poignant moment for me of the day was on his way out, after he's given his evidence, he just took a very brief moment just to shake Dennis Glennon's hand as he walked past. Someone who, I didn't see it myself, but someone who was in court who did see it, said that Dennis just mouthed thank you to him as he walked out. So, as you say, it's just one of those tiny moments in time that has had the discovery that's had such repercussions for so many people for so many years.
In Claremont, the night that Ciara disappeared, we've been talking through this podcast, and Tim, you've mentioned them a few times, the Burger Boys, and we've been waiting to hear what they saw, and today they gave their testimonies. Yeah,
well, two of them did, Nat. Yes, there were three on the night, but two of those gentlemen, school friends, we found out today from a northern suburb of Perth called Balga, which is just around the corner from where I live, working class suburb, and they said that that was probably their first ever night out in Claremont, certainly at the Conti. They said they'd never been there before, and what a night they chose, because they basically described how they'd gone in, enjoyed a few beers, enjoyed each other's company, kept themselves to themselves, and then basically at closing time, Mr. Bond, who was the first witness, was asked, how are you feeling? And he said hungry. So that's where they ended up at Hungry Jack's, which is just around the corner.
And for people on the East Coast, that's the equivalent of Burger King.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So Burger King overseas, Hungry Jack's here. So they took a little laneway down there, got their food, and then rather than sit in, they decided to have a bit of fresh air while they enjoyed their food, and so they sat on the bus stop, which for people in Perth, Western Australia, if you haven't driven down Stirling Highway and past that bus stop to and from Fremantle, then you basically haven't lived in Western Australia, because, I mean, everyone in Western Australia would have made that journey at one time or the other.
Yes.
So that's where they sat, and over the course of the 5-10 minutes, they noticed a young lady on the other side of the road walking south or towards the Fremantle, sort of left to right as they would have been viewing it. As we've discussed before, one of the group, the second guy to give evidence today, actually said he was so shocked because he saw her, or thought he saw her, putting her hand up in the
extending
Universal
her arm out,
sign
hitchhike.
to hitchhike, which, given what had happened in Claremont over the preceding 14 months, he was staggered with.
Yes.
And then he also said that he noticed a car, a white station wagon, and he was very clear on the description, and we'll get to that in a minute, driving much slower than the speed limit. He remembered seeing it going in the same direction as he'd seen this young lady walking. So that was the crux of the evidence. But as the car and the lady sort of disappeared into the distance, they also, one of the number, Mr. Bond, said he saw her, that car stopped, and he saw the lady, which we think is Ciara, leaning into that car.
And why had they noticed this car particularly?
They were just sitting there watching, weren't they? And it was very, very quiet. They said there's no traffic. They spotted her on her own, which prompted him to call out, you're stupid hitchhiking, of which she said the girl just threw her arms up like, mind your own business type of thing, and kept walking. And so he said there's no traffic around. They were just sitting, enjoying their burger and just staring across the street where she was, just right on the other side of the street near the intersection. And that's how they took note of everything.
Yeah, and then the second of the boys, the Burger boys, he said he had a particular interest in VS Holden Commodores at the time.
That's right, yes. Oh, what an amazing description,
Yeah, he was driving a car not as prestigious at the time, shall we say, and I think that was his wish to maybe get hold of one of these Commodores. And it was a particular type of Commodore that he was interested in, and lo and behold, he said it was this particular type of Commodore that was driving past. White, but with a distinctive white bumper that matched the paintwork rather than a two-tone bumper as you normally get. Oh. And also a distinctive type of hubcap, which he described as having a teardrop motif on it, and some slating, some shallow sort of grooves in between these teardrops. And so they were a particular type of hubcap and a particular type of bumper, and he was very distinctive, and he said, I'm pretty sure that is a VS or a VR Series 1 or 2 Commodore, white, which we've heard so much about, because that is the type of Commodore that the prosecutors say that Mr. Edwards was driving at the time as a Telstra-issued car. But the one thing that he was asked about and didn't have any memory of was any insignia or logo or branding or livery on the side of this car. He said he could not remember seeing any sort of logo, be it Telstra or Telecom or otherwise, on this car. But everything else that he described was in immaculate detail, given to be fair, the amount of beers he'd had on the night and also the amount of time that has passed since.
Yeah, well, he's clearly a car buff and it's caught his attention and he's remembered these details. Did that pretty much match up with, apart from the fact that there was no Telstra logos, did it match up with other descriptions of cars, basically?
Well, he was cross-examined by defence lawyer Paul Jovich, and he did concede that the model that he described also could have matched 2 or 3 other types of white Commodores.
Yeah.
He wasn't quite sure when the colour-coded bumper and that sort of thing was. If it was just restricted to the one he talked about, it could have been another 2 or 3. So he did concede that. But, of course, it did contrast starkly with what one of the other eyewitnesses described Ciara getting into. As we heard, he talked about a Ford Ute with a canopy over it.
We haven't heard that before, have we?
No, we haven't. It was absolutely a bombshell, because he also insisted that he saw a woman describing, sort of matching Ciara's description, get into to this ute with the guy holding the tailgate up the back. So that was just so bizarre. And then Paul Jovich said to him, so you know Fords? He said, yes, I worked with Ford for a while. So he knew his Ford, and he was adamant. This was another fellow who was driving, well, he wasn't driving as a passenger with his wife, again, near the intersection of Stirling Highway and Bayview Terrace.
Is this the wife who was driving home the husband from the pub?
No, they'd been watching the football.
And driving a friend home. They're going in the other direction.
There was an particular AFL football match on for our international listeners. AFL is Australian rules football, so that's the sort of indigenous football code that is basically a religion in Western Australia for about 9 months of the year and most of the other country. I looked it up, actually. It was an old Ansett Cup match, semi-final, which was the old pre-season game. Geelong won by a point for anyone that's taking particular notes. So it was that game.
These really are excellent details.
Doing a lot of homework here, Tim.
And that had finished quite late. And as we'd heard in testimony yesterday, these boys friends had been having quite a few drinks, and then basically the friend, well, according to the wife, wouldn't leave, and she had to get him to leave. And so to get him to leave, she offered to give him a lift home. So that's what they were doing on Stirling Highway. And Ali's right. It was a complete outlier. The description of the car, the description of the make. The description of the lady that he saw was consistent, or somewhat consistent to everyone else. But the car was a complete outlier. And basically, I think that goes to some of the rough edges that Mr. Jovich was talking about in his opening, and that we've mentioned before. That obviously these witnesses have been filtered somewhat. In terms of the sightings, but this one, as you say, maybe proves that it's not complete sort of neat little package that the prosecutors would hope to paint.
Well, what you do have is, as often happens, you've got, about a dozen witnesses all seeing completely different things, and the discrepancies is. What I find interesting is the men can describe hubcaps right down to the little design, yet they couldn't tell what she had on. As far as jewellery, no jewellery bags or wall sides, where the women honed in and said, well, we don't know what car really it was, but she was wearing such and such jewellery. She had a chain on her handbag.
Length of her skirt and the colour of the hair.
The size of the whole lot. They knew exactly what. In fact, one poor guy who was asked, was it a black jacket or a cardigan? And to him, he couldn't tell the difference because he said, well, a jacket to him is a suit jacket with lapels, so anything else was a cardigan. In
the global picture, as we touched on with Tom Percy last week, they're details that are interesting day to day, but whether it's going to be the straw that breaks the prosecutor's back, I wouldn't have thought so.
Well, it really did jump around today, and we've actually had some listeners commenting on that and saying, it can be quite difficult to follow because it's not in any kind of chronological order, and witnesses are pulled from all over the place and all different times of the events and what have you. And again, today that was exactly the case, right? Because you were sort of tying up these loose ends. So going back in time, you heard from an officer who worked in the sexual assault squad. What was that in relation to?
Yeah, so she was the officer that was, to put it into context, she was June 1996, she began on that squad. So we know that by that time Ciara is already missing and Jane's body has already been discovered. She was tasked by the Macro Task Force, which is basically the task force that was set up when the fears of a serial killer on the loose in Perth were basically confirmed. And she had been tasked to re-interview the victim of the rape in Karrakatta from early 95. So that's an interesting tidbit in itself, that the connection, forgive me if I'm wrong, Ali, but the connection between that rape was never really publicly made. There was hints of it, and I know in the paper we drew some comparisons, but it was never formally confirmed by Macro at the time that was part of their investigation. But we know today that in June, an officer was basically said, go and re-interview her, go and get as much detail as you can, because we obviously think there might be a connection. And so this was this officer's testimony today about going to re-interview, but more importantly, getting the exhibits from that crime, which include the shorts that we've already discussed, are crucial, going and physically picking those up from the evidence a lockup in a police HQ in Perth and taking them away.
So she was questioned quite extensively about whether she opened bags or didn't open bags and how she labelled and the processes there. What did you learn from that?
Well,
we learned that the defence are owning him very closely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in terms of the trial, we've learned, and we probably knew it before, but we certainly know it now, that's where 90% of the focus is going to be on who handled what, where they got it from, who labelled it, who they gave it to next. And in this particular case, she was questioned several times. Did you open the bags? Did you check what was in the bags? Because there was some little confusion about how many items there were. So these were basically the clothes that were left behind or who were on the victim of Karrakatta, including the hospital pants that she was put into after she was discovered, and also this cord that was left on her to bind her arms. This was all obviously seized at the time, either from the site or from her in person, put into evidence bags and stored.
Certainly very lengthy cross-examination, probably the longest we've seen Paul Jovic.
Yeah, probably.
Do today,
and he was trying to discover, obviously, where she got them from, at what time she got them from, how she signed them out, and again, most importantly, whether she opened the bags, because
was she adamant that she hadn't?
She was adamant that she hadn't. She was adamant that she'd never opened an evidence bag in all her time in the police force. She's a retired police officer now, but she'd worked in serious crime, sex crime, child sex crime. Yeah. She was adamant that she'd never done it ever, because she took what was in the bag, descriptions from the labelling and the way it was logged in these books. If you can imagine a green leather-bound book that they used to handwrite. I mean, it's almost unfathomable now that they'd handwrite all the different evidence exhibits and logs and numbers and who signed them and who had them when, in longhand, in person, in a book, and there it would stay. And we saw pictures of that book today. There was mention of quite an early adopter sort of primitive computer system that was just coming in at the time. So that might play into some of the prosecution's sort of, cross-examination about, where certain exhibits were at certain times and whether they were logged on the computer. Yeah. But as I said, it was a taster, really, a flavour of what's to come.
Would it be sort of the first time you would say that I guess you've seen a witness really, I mean, I guess people would say see them grilled?
Yeah, put under a certain amount of pressure, definitely.
Yeah. Today's was, yes.
And I'm just curious about, there was a statement read in by the Australian Border Force. Was there anything interesting there or unusual there?
Yeah, so that was concerning, not as you might imagine if Miss Spears or Miss Glennon or Miss Rimmer had been abroad, but more the Edwards family, whether they'd been abroad. And this goes to way back in the first week. We heard that Mr. and Mrs. Edwards, Bradley Edwards' mother and father, they were in Indonesia. They were in overseas at a certain point, which meant that he'd moved out of the marital home at that time and gone to live with them, and those dates correlate to some sort of the time over when the later murders were committed. And so it's basically to show that he would have been home alone, or he would have been alone at a home during that time. And to do that, they produced this travel document which shows Mr. and Mrs. Edwards overseas.
Extraordinary details, aren't there? I mean, they've gone to unbelievable lengths to snatch all these details from all these various departments.
That's what you have to do now. I mean, it's all very well saying it in an opening and us all writing it down and getting reported and the judge hearing it. But as anyone who covers court or attends court for any length of time will hear a defence lawyer say in every opening, the opening is not evidence. The evidence is the evidence, and that was the evidence of that. That's what you've got to do. You've got to produce a document to show that whomever it might be was abroad or wasn't abroad.
Yes.
I mean, we got medical records today from Mr. Edwards' first wife as well to show. So their Medicare cards, which is the equivalent of the National Health Service in the UK, or to show when her doctor's appointments were and when she claimed those Medicare payments on those doctor's appointments and the sonogram for her baby. So we know when that doctor's appointment was, which feeds into when she might have told Mr. Edwards he was pregnant, which feeds into when he might have been emotionally upset. So
because there was conflicting evidence with that particular information, wasn't there?
There was some confusion over timings, yes. But once you've got that document that shows the absolute date, then that's pretty redoubtable proof.
Yeah. Okay, so court... Yeah, sorry, Ali.
No, I was just saying, and the judge too, Justice Hall, is picking up on things too. He's from both counsel. He's clarifying. His eye for detail is incredible. Totally. It really is. I mean, amidst the ton of information that he's had to process in the last month, he was the first one in court to pick up that there was a difference between the number of exhibits in that log, and that green log book. When he said, was it to or was it from? He picked her up on that.
Yeah. So there was a slight difference in the number of exhibits in that green log book to the receipt. So when you take out the exhibits, or used to take out the exhibits from that strong holding at the police HQ, you get a receipt to say who'd taken it, what you'd taken, and how many exhibits. And there was 8 on the one and 7 on the other. And without, no one else had picked it up in court, and he banged straight on it. Why is that? Mr. Hollingsworth, who's one of the other barristers, and he was coming to it, obviously, but it just goes to show just the power of concentration of someone at that level of
judiciary.
Jurists, at that level of the judiciary, the smarts and the concentration you have is second to none, really.
Well, one of our podcast listeners has actually sent in a question about that and marvelled at how Justice Hall can retain all this information and wanted to know, is there some kind of a spreadsheet, this Excel spreadsheet where he goes away and puts all this information into?
Well, staring at his computer quite intently, and he's got
and he takes notes. And look, I mean, he's got the backup of 2 what they so-called associates, which are basically his staff members. He gets the transcript of the court proceeding every day, but we're as in the media room, we're getting that as well, and we're up to 3 very thick A4 binders already into week 4.
Yeah.
He gets all the exhibits, obviously. So he, as much as we've said it's a trial by judge alone, it's not really. He has got backup, but it's up
to him entirely.
It is him on his own in terms of actually making the rulings and making the decisions on the law and and at the end of the day on guilt and innocence.
And analyse absolutely every statement that he makes, why he's saying this and what the outcome. Yeah. So that's a lot of documents to consider at the end of it.
Yes.
Okay, so court will wrap up now until January the 6th.
Correct.
And were you given a brief indication of what we would expect when we first come back?
Yes, we were. We were told that after the 2 civilian witnesses that the prosecution needs to call because they're unwell or unavailable at the moment, they'll go into the scientific, the fibres, the DNA, the expert witnesses, and I think they said right through January, right through February before the prosecution will even probably look at ending its case.
Oh, mate, Ali's been
January, February, March.
Optimistic.
I'm being hopeful.
So there was a brief bit of timetabling. So the January the 6th we're back. The first month or that whole month will basically be taken up with the 2 burial sites. So so Jane will be first, obviously first in time, and that will go right through from the very first police officer that attended. All of those will be called, all the forensic officers, the people that recorded the scene digitally, photographically at the time and videotaped it. Then there will be the removal of the body, which will include undertakers and funeral directors, and then we'll go through all the exact same process with Ciara's discovery and burial site. So that's going to be a month, basically, of that type of evidence. And then we will get into fibres first, we think, and DNA. And that's going to be at least a month each, probably more, because that, as we've said so many times, that is the heart of this case. And just a little aside, the defence is calling its own experts on the fibres, and their expert has been working through the night for many, many months, and his report that to the defence is due to them only on this coming Friday, December the 20th. That's when they will get it in their hands, and then they've got to disclose that to the prosecution, which will basically be the defence telling the prosecution, this is going to be our case on the fibres. And Ms. Barbagallo flagged today, we're still unsure as how long that portion of the trial will take, because we really don't know the defence.
Right.
But what Mr. Jovic has said today, confirmed today, is they're not going to be really arguing about whether that fibre could have come from a Commodore or could have come from this type of Telstra shorts. So it's not the actual provenance in terms of whether that fibre is that fibre, but it's the continuity of them. So you know, whether those fibres could have got onto exhibits in another way, or whether it could be from another source, so another Commodore or another pair of those Telstra shorts. Is there any possibility that they could have come into contact with any of those victims? So that's basically where January, February, March, and maybe April are going to go, depending on how long we go. Then we've got DNA, and then we've got there'll be stuff about the knife. There'll be some stuff about the they're going to bring even some criminal statistics in to try and show whether these three murders were part of a bigger series possibly, or whether they were self-contained. So there's a long way to go. Although we've gone through all these civilian witnesses quite quickly, there is a long evidentiary road ahead.
Yeah, it really is the most extraordinary trial we've ever seen, and you can understand why people are calling it the trial of the century. It's extraordinary. Yeah,
I think at times in January and February we're going to feel like it's going to go for a century because it's going to be very intense. But it's work that needs to be done.
Well, thank you both for your hard yards over the past 3.5 weeks. You've both been incredible and, providing us with these extraordinary details. And, of course, you're not just doing podcasts, you're writing extensive articles for the West Australian newspaper. And, Alison, of course, you're reporting for 7 News and there's online. And so there is a lot of work going on apart from this. So we really do appreciate your time every day running out of court and keeping us up to date with all these details. So thank you both. And thanks to everyone who's been listening in. We will be checking emails over the Christmas break, so you can continue to contact us on claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and we'll also probably be dropping a few bonus episodes, so keep an eye out for those. And from all of us, have a great Christmas. We'll speak to you again Monday 6th of January when the trial resumes, and we return with Claremont in Conversation. See you then.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.